Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is let's start this from the beginning in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 31, Swordsman of the Mist. Let's start this from the beginning. Swordsman of the Mist. I didn't take you for someone interested in learning medical ninjutsu. Itaka turned around, a notebook still open in his hands. In our profession, you never know when you'll run into a situation where knowing how to heal your comrades could come in handy. You might want to give it a try too. Meh, Kakashi shrugged. It's mandatory in the Umbu to get some healing classes before you're allowed into active duty, so I'm alright. He gave the masked man a dry look, knowing full well that Kakashi would visit one of these classes sooner rather than later. There were many shinobi who thought that the basics they knew were more than enough for small injuries and that the rest could be done by professional medic nins, believing these new public courses to be entirely unnecessary and useless. However, there were also some like Itaka that saw the value in them, not only because being able to heal your comrades was a valuable skill to have, but also because some of the techniques could also be used for other purposes. No matter what Kakashi might say, he knew that the man was part of the latter group rather than the former. It would still be a more worthwhile use of your time than reading these books of yours, Itaka finally replied with a pointed look at the orange novel in Kakashi's hand. I'm afraid I must disagree with you on that, he said, sounding much more serious than before. Mental welfare is essential to keep a shinobi going. That means you need enough downtime to relax and recuperate from your missions, and nothing helps to calm you down more than the Ika Ika series. He gave him a one-eyed smile. You might want to give it a try too. Itaka thought his mother would probably not be amused to find him reading what was essential porn. He didn't think she would try to forbid him from reading it, but it would surely create an awkward atmosphere at home. Seeing his unimpressed look, Kakashi sighed. Tsunade-sama is back for little more than a month and already people start losing sight of what's truly important. It's really disheartening. Our definitions of important seem to be quite different, then. Nonetheless, in a way, Kakashi was right that some things were already changing as a result of Tsunade's return. The aforementioned healing courses were a prime example of that. The first thing the Sunin had done was surveying the hospital, finding it and its staff severely lacking, and then setting about to change that. While Itaka had little to do with that and didn't know anyone that did either, some of the stories he heard were rather extreme. Tsunade certainly didn't mince her words or felt the need to hold back the volume of her voice, to say the very least. It made him wonder if she had been like that when she became Hokage in the other timeline as well, and whether he might actually have dodged a bullet by being a nuke nin at the time. However, once she felt that she had set everything in motion that needed to be done in order to improve the conditions in the hospital, Tsunade also organized a refresh and training program for every interested shinobi in Konoha. The idea was that while professional medics would still be the ones who deal with serious injuries, every single shinobi would be able to at the very least provide effective first aid. That would then eventually result in much fewer casualties in the field. This offer stood for barely 2 weeks now and yet was already a moderate success. For all that many shinobi mocked the program all the time, just as many were actually interested in it. Especially those who had lost a teammate they were close to in the past appreciated the chance to stop such a thing from happening in the future. Another thing that was in the process of being implemented was an increased emphasis on healing at the academy. He had heard Sasuke and Naruto complain about it because they found it boring, but Itaka approved of the idea. After all, everything that improved the survival chances of the next generation was a good thing in his book. Not only would this step increase their overall skill in that art, but it might also motivate more students to become healers in the future. There had been fewer and fewer shinobi who wanted to become medic nins ever since Tsunade left the village, to the point where there was a slight lack of them already, so this step would hopefully change that. Itaka knew that the Sandaime had even thought about letting her hold a lecture at the academy for that, though he hadn't dared to propose that to her face yet. However, it was a side effect of the aforementioned remodeling of the academy's curriculum that brought the greatest change, for it appeared that the program there hadn't been as challenging as it should have. In fact, the requirements for graduating were as low as they had ever been. The reason for that, as it turned out, was quite simple. Especially during the last days of the Third Shinobi World War, more and more children were sent to the battlefields. Many skills essential for a shinobi were taught less and less in the academy to focus more on direct combat abilities. Because of that, students graduated at an ever-decreasing age. This trend continued for a while even after the war had officially ended, as people were still waiting whether fighting would break out again or not, but then, when it appeared the peace would hold, things changed. Just days before his death, the Yondaime approved of a modification of the curriculum that put less focus on combat activity and more on secondary and supportive skills to compensate for the previous favoritism. This measure was meant to be a temporary one, but unfortunately, the Yondaime died just shortly after during the Ninetales attack that then resulted in the Sandaime getting back into office. There was a lot of chaos and uncertainty in the aftermath of the attack, so it was somewhat understandable that this unrelated decision fell under the table. The truly problematic thing was that the Sandaime too, unaware of the Yondaime's previous change, ordered the academy to decrease their combat training for the very same reason. While this change was indeed just temporarily, the status quo that was restored afterwards wasn't actually the originally intended curriculum but its lesser version that the Yondaime had approved of. As a result, the training at the academy had been lacking for years now. Itaka could only hope that this had been discovered in the old timeline as well, but he was afraid the odds were that it hadn't. It was a shame that so many senior instructors of the academy had died in the attack as well. Had that not been the case, one of them could have informed the Hokage of the situation and avoid the problem entirely. Anyway, Kakashi said, pulling Itaka from his thoughts. We should really get going. Hokage-sama will be angry if we are too late for the meeting. He blinked in surprise before the words registered in his mind, making him narrow his eyes accusingly. What meeting? Kakashi gave him a look of pure innocence. Oh, I didn't say. We are supposed to meet Hokage-sama for a mission debriefing. And when exactly was that meeting supposed to be? Itaka was proud to say that his voice sounded completely casual. Not an easy feat considering Kakashi's tendency to arrive late for every and all appointments, especially when Itaka himself followed the mentality to always arrive 10 minutes prior to the agreed time. Half an hour ago, give or take a few minutes. Probably seeing something in Itaka's eyes, he then raised his arms in surrender. But in my defense, Itaka didn't wait for Kakashi to finish his no doubt brilliant excuse before he vanished in a shunshin. So you're interested in these guys, huh? Thinking about making them join as well. You still don't have a partner, Pain said. With them, we can fill 2 teams in one sweep. Kisame chuckled. I don't think any of them will be too impressed by that idea. They're not exactly a hospitable bunch, yeah no? I'm honestly surprised that they work together as it is. His former comrades were a funny group, they could work together without a hitch for a time, only to suddenly start trying to kill each other at a second's notice. Without the structure of a village to keep them in check, he thought it likely that this trait had grown only stronger over the years. They will not have a choice in that matter. It was this attitude that made Kisame like the official leader of Akatsuki. For all that he knew that it was Madara who truly pulled the strings in the background, Pain was still someone he could respect. If not for his character and conviction, then at least for his strength. Well, I guess I will pay my old friends a little visit, then. Being Hokage came with a lot of work. From the moment the first rays of light brightened the sky until the sun vanished on the horizon, Hiruzen sat in his office doing paperwork. Sometimes even longer. Aside from that, there was also the endless stream of meetings with worried citizens, possible clients, his advisors, diplomats, clan heads, and politicians in general. Add the general weight of being responsible for every single person in the village and you got what he had to endure for way too many decades now. A thing Hiruzen had learned very early into his reign was that he needed to find enjoyment wherever he could find it. Otherwise, he could just as well kill himself on the spot. Watching Kakashi's and Itaka's faces when they realized that they weren't actually too late at all because he had intentionally told Kakashi the wrong time, with the former's falling in dismay while the latter kept his intentionally blank to hide his irritation, was one of these moments. I'm glad you managed to get here just in time, he greeted his 2 shinobi. Especially you, Kakashi. It's great to see you taking my summons seriously for once. The man gave him a one-eyed smile. Of course, Hokage-sama. It sounded urgent, so I deliberately avoided my poor, sick neighbor so she couldn't ask me for help. I would have hated to be late for that. Hiruzen nodded seriously. That's very considerate of you. If I may, Hokage-sama, Itaka spoke up, the annoyance he must surely feel perfectly hidden behind his usual polite mask. What is this meeting about? Knowing that the time to fool around was over, he got straight to the topic at hand. I'm sending you two on a mission. A pause. An S-rank 1. Even a genin would have been able to spot the moment the two jonin became serious. Itaka, already standing attention from the very beginning, subtly straightened up even more while Kakashi's eyes, previously neutral at best and bored at worst, suddenly had a hard glint to them. When Hiruzen was confident that he had their full attention, he continued. As you're doubtlessly aware, we had representatives from Kirigakure as our guest for over a month now. The negotiations have gone well and the water daimyo has already given his consent to the terms, so all that's left now is for our very own fire daimyo to do the same. The diplomat currently present here will soon be escorted to the capital to deal with that. In the meanwhile, you two will set out to fulfill one of the most essential parts of the agreement. He pulled a stack of papers from one of his drawers. This is a list of recent raids on villages and towns in the land of waterfalls as well as foreign caravans that were traveling through it for trade. He paused for a second. According to what little information we have, the culprits behind this are Kushimaru Kuriareri and Jinin Akabino, two former members of the 7 ninja swordsmen of the mist now turned Nuknins. Your mission will be to travel to their last known location close to the border between the lands of waterfalls and grass, track them down, and then eliminate them. Neither Itaka nor Kakashi overly reacted to that, but he could see that they knew what that meant. The swordsmen of the mist were second only to the Mizukage in strength, and it was said that every one of them was strong enough to conquer a small nation by themselves. Whether that was true or not was questionable, but the point was that people could claim it to be true without other people laughing into their faces. Their strength was simply that impressive. Itaka probably knew that better than everyone else in this room. Will it only be the two of us, Hokage-sama? Kakashi asked. While I'm confident in our abilities, it seems rather risky to not bring some more assistance with us. Itaka nodded his agreement. Kiri's diplomat brought a guard with him, Hiruzen said. Zabuza, another member of the 7 swordsmen and currently the only one of that group left to Kirigakure. He and some additional aid from Kiri that's already on its way as we speak will support you on this mission. I wanted to send some more of our people as well, but unfortunately, while both parties agreed that making this a joint mission would be beneficial, the Mizukage wants it to look like it was mainly them who took out 2 of the most famous Nuknins from their village. Because of that, you two will be the only shinobi from Konoha that participate in it. Not only were the 2 swordsmen famous, but they also caused a lot of trouble for their former home by openly attacking caravans from their newly acquired trade partners. That obviously made these parties feel uneasy and might even lead to them terminate their contracts with the Land of Water. Eliminating these troublesome elements would not only end the threat that the Nuknins posed in general but also show their partners that they could protect them while simultaneously demonstrating strength. Especially this soon after the end of its civil war, that was something Kiri desperately wanted to do. However, that would only work if it were they who could be credited with the deed, not Konoha. Hiruzen himself had good reason to want these criminals brought to justice as well. After all, many of these foreign caravans that had been attacked either hailed from the Land of Fire or traveled through it and thus were under his protection. Do we have information on their abilities? He nodded at Itaka's question. We do. In addition to what we already possessed ourselves, the Mizukage saw it fit to share their intel with us. He pulled 2 scrolls with both the information about their targets and the general mission details from his drawer before handing them over. Kushimaru Kuriareri and Jinin Akabino wield the unique long sword Nuiberi and the weapon Kabutori, which is basically a giant axe and hammer that are linked end-to-end by a rope, respectively. Kushimaru is known for his exceptional speed and dexterity, as well as his tendency to use traps that cripple his enemies before he finishes them off himself. Jinin, on the other hand, prefers a more direct and brute force way of fighting. He quite literally hammers and slices his way through his enemies in the most gruesome way possible. Furthermore, they were both noted in the past to be especially cruel even compared to their colleagues. As you two have surely already realized, their abilities complement each other, and they make up for their weaknesses even more by utilizing their famous silent killing technique under the cover of thick mist. I recommend separating them from each other when engaging them before overwhelming them with your numbers. While a dangerous mission, Hiruzen was confident that they could do this. Both Kakashi and Itachi were some of the strongest shinobi in Konoha, and while these two fugitive swordsmen were no doubt powerful, he didn't think they stood a chance against his own shinobi. Especially not when they had additional aid from Kirigakure. You will meet Zabuza tomorrow at 0600 in the morning at the gate and then depart from there. There is no time limit set for this mission. You will search for your targets either as long as it takes to find them or until you decided further search is unlikely to yield results. In that case, you will return to the village immediately. In consideration of this mission's nature, you will be granted additional funds to fulfill the mission to the best of your abilities for as long as possible. Also, as usual for S-rank missions, every secret drop point throughout the continent will be made available for you. An updated list with all their locations is included in the scrolls I already gave you. I don't think I need to remind you of this, but as this information is on a need-to-know basis, you will destroy the list once you have memorized its content. He looked them both in their eyes. Do you have any questions? No, Hokage-sama. No, Hokage-sama. Very well, then, he said. In that case, please use the rest of the day to rest and prepare. You are dismissed. As he watched both men leave the room, already turned towards each other to discuss their thoughts on the upcoming mission, Hiruzen couldn't ignore the ominous feeling that was spreading through his chest. S-rank missions were always dangerous and unpredictable, and they had a tendency to get out of hand real quick. He was confident in his men and truly believed that they could overcome whatever stood in their way, but he was also allowed to worry. Not that this changed anything. Itachi must be on this mission as his presence was specifically requested by the Mizukage and Kakashi was the only suitable powerful shinobi currently in the village that could accompany him. Even if Hiruzen felt uneasy about it, as long as he had no very good reason to call them back, this was the only way of action. Still, I have a bad feeling about this. She had no idea how long she had been here. There was no window in the cell and no candle to dispel the darkness. The only times she saw light was when the squeaky door opened during one of the irregular visits from one of her captors. Unfortunately, rather than being a welcome sight, she dreaded these moments as after all this time in the darkness, even that little light caused her unimaginable pain. Even keeping her eyelids shut wouldn't stop the burning sensation in her eyes that felt as if someone was gauging them out with iron pincers whenever the door opened. And that was still the least painful part of these visits. She had been a farmer's daughter. All her life, the most exciting thing that ever happened was listening to the gossip in her town's cavern she wasn't supposed to visit but did anyway. Other than that, there was no excitement. She rose early with the sun, helped her mother and younger sister in the household, and sometimes even accompanied her father to the fields. She joked with her friends, flirted with the cute boy from the farm next to hers, and occasionally took one of the horses for a ride into the nearby woods. She had complained all her life that nothing interesting ever happened to her boring hometown and told everyone that cared to listen that she would one day leave for one of the big capitals or maybe even one of the hidden villages to find wealth and fame there. Then she would one day return, amazing everyone with her expensive clothes and exquisite food. Her stupid little hometown, now not even worth being drawn onto maps, would be known all over the continent solely because she originated from it. Now there wasn't even anything left of it. For her stupid little hometown, the place where nothing ever happened, had been annihilated by them. She didn't know why, but on the day they arrived, they had mercilessly slaughtered and destroyed everything as they pleased. She had seen the mutilated corpses before she had been captured, had seen the bodies piled up in the dozens in a sickening display of cruelty, and had seen the people pulled from their houses and other hiding places to join the dead. No one had been spared, from the youngest babe to the sickest eldest. Everyone was killed without hesitation. Only a small group that included her had been taken prisoners. She wished they had just killed her instead. The skin where the handcuffs bit into her flesh had long since been rubbed raw, and she almost found herself thankful for the chains that kept her upright hanging from her arms, as this at least meant she had no feeling left in them, allowing her to escape the pain from that wound at least. Unfortunately, she had no similar reprise from whatever they had done to her back that made her feel like her spine had been relocated all the wrong way, or the pulsating pain in her legs that were more dead tissue, brown bumps, and scales than actual flesh at this point. She didn't react when a drop of liquid fell into the little puddle beneath her feet. The only sounds in the cell were her ragged breathing and the plops when drops of her blood joined the rest of her life force on the ground, so she had grown used to it ages ago. That didn't make the sensation of warm blood running down her body any more comfortable, though. She was pulled from the thoughts of her own misery by the familiar and very much dreaded squeaking tone of an opening door. "And no," she whispered hoarsely, her fear even overpowering the pain as her eyes burned from the sudden light. Please, I beg of you. No more dash." "Hush, my dear," the young man interrupted her gently with a smile that was as fake as any she had ever seen. "It will be much easier if you don't fight me. I promise I will hurry, so please just concentrate on not dying this time as well. I grow tired of needing to revive you all the time." She tried to move backwards when he pulled out a syringe from one of the 2 suitcases he had brought with him, but the chains that held her didn't allow her to do more than slightly wiggle on the spot. "Please." His false smile didn't even waver. "Don't worry. One way or another, it will all be over soon." That, she knew, was a lie. This nightmare would never end. Chapter 32, Swordsman of the Mist 2. Let's start this from the beginning. Swordsman of the Mist 2. The 7 ninja swordsmen of the mist were a group of highly violent and cruel individuals who were fortunate enough to have been born with the necessary skill to rise in rank until they were in a position that allowed them to freely live out their proclivities. Had they been anything less than one of the most powerful assets of their country, and Kirigakure specifically, their nature would have probably resulted in a death sentence for most of them, while the few that were capable of controlling themselves if necessary would have been forced to hide their true selves for the rest of their lives. Zabuza was part of the second group, and while Kiri's current policy was to distance themselves from those actions that brought them the nickname Village of the Bloody Mist, he was satisfied with how things currently were going. As long as he was still sent on missions that allowed him to soil the ground in the blood of his enemies, he was happy enough to pretend he wasn't a cruel monster in the presence of others. All the better then that his current mission would allow him to do just that. Considering what kind of people had made up the 7 swordsmen, it was no surprise to anyone that most members dearly wished to kill each other. Companionship between them was rare while rivalries were the norm. Zabuza was no exception to that, and Kushimaru and Jinin had been the ones from his colleagues he had always hated the most. Needless to say, being given the opportunity to hunt them down and them himself filled him with anticipation and glee. If this was Mei's apology for making him play bodyguard to some stupid diplomat, he would gladly accept it. 2 chakra signatures closing in on his position from the direction of Konoha behind him made him stop in his tracks and turn around, waiting for who must surely be the Konohanin that would join him on this mission. To be honest, he disliked the idea of foreign shinobi being part of this. It was already bad enough that he would need to deal with whatever support from his own village would arrive, but having these 2 with him as well was just too much. The new alliance between their villages notwithstanding, in his mind, dealing with his former colleagues was an internal matter that Konoha had no business sticking its nose in. Alas, he had no say in that decision and could do nothing but accept it. Zabuza had learned a long time ago that crying about things you couldn't change wouldn't help anyone and thus was a big waste of time. Although at least in the privacy of his mind would Zabuza also confess that he was kind of curious about one of the 2 Konohanin. After all, Mei had been telling stories about this prodigious Uchiha brat that arranged for them to get aid from Konoha for years now. It was high time that he met him. 2 figures appeared in front of him in a twirl of leaves. Zabuza-san, the one that must be the copy ninja Kakashi Hatake, spoke up first, his voice sounding bored as if he found it a bother to be here. "We were told to meet at the gate, not several miles away from it. A message telling us that you went ahead would have been highly appreciated." He shrugged. "You found me just fine, didn't you? Besides, I was even forthcoming enough to only walk at a casual pace instead of running ahead, so I don't see the problem. We are supposed to be a team for the duration of this mission," Zabuza-san, the person he was more interested in, said. "We should use the time we have as efficiently as we can to prepare for the forthcoming confrontations. Acting like this endangers not only the mission itself but all of us as well, so we would be thankful if you could refrain from doing such a thing in the future." The brat's voice was neither cold nor antagonistic, but it also couldn't be called polite or even emotionless. It was hard to put a name to it, but Zabuza thought that he would probably do well in politics. His poker face was certainly better than most he had ever seen. It was just too bad that such things didn't matter to him. "And why should I care if my actions endanger you? I can handle myself just fine, and if you're too weak to do the same when there are even two of you, there is no place for you on this mission. Kushimaru and Jinin would eat you alive. The brat looked unimpressed. Nonetheless, we still ask you to coordinate your future moves with us just like we will do with you. I also remind you that part of our, he pointed at himself and the copy Nina, mission is to evaluate the cooperation between our two villages during the mission. Depending on our assessment, the alliance between Kirigakure and Konohagakure might come to an end before it even had the chance to flourish. Knowing that the bandages he wore over the lower part of his face would hide it, Zabuza allowed his lips to curve upwards. Going so far as to threaten me to arrange an end to the alliance if I don't behave. I gotta hand it to him, he has balls. He seriously doubted the two of them had actually the power to pull such a thing off, no matter that they were both famous or that the brat was the heir to the Uchiha clan. Furthermore, it was also quite unlikely that the Hokage had given them such a mission in the first place. After all, breaking an alliance because the teamwork on one mission was lacking would be stupid, and while the professor was many things, Zabuza didn't think he was that. All the more reason to respect the brat. Lying to his face without hesitation or any sign that what he said wasn't true was a bold move. Yes, that would indeed be troublesome, he agreed before releasing a small amount of bloodlust. However, if the two of you don't survive the mission, there will be no report for you to give, right? Maybe I should end this little problem right here and now. Neither Konohana even batted an eye, but Zabuza knew that they were mentally preparing for a fight. There are precautionary measures in place should such an unfathomable tragedy happen, of course, Kakashi said with a bored drawl and one hand casually in his pocket. Also, it would probably not look too good in a report if both of us died while you were still alive. He was just about to reply to that when the Uchiha spoke up again. Besides, there are two of us while you're alone. You should remember that the odds of you dying on this mission are twice as high as the ones of both of us doing so. This threat was more cleverly hidden than Zabuza's own had been, but it was a threat nonetheless. A reminder that he was outnumbered and more likely to die in a confrontation against them than to come out victorious. Itachi Uchiha was big for a 13-year-old boy, yes, but he was still by far the smallest one of their group, and not even the flak jacket he wore and the serious expression on his face could hide the underlining youth in his features. However, there was also a darkness in his gaze that made even him feel cold for a moment. It wasn't the usual thing you saw in the eyes of experienced and accomplished shinobi, and neither was it the look of a monster in human skin that could be seen in people like Zabuza himself or even his former acquaintance Kisame. There was no cruelty to it, no thirst for blood and no enjoyment in slaughter. It wasn't even indifference. No, Zabuza couldn't pinpoint what it was, but he understood what it meant. Something must have happened to the Uchiha, something that went even beyond what a regular shinobi went through in their life. Something personal. Whatever this thing in the boy's eyes was, it told him that there was literally nothing he wouldn't do or hadn't already done to achieve some specific goal. Zabuza also realized that he hadn't just seen it by accident but had deliberately been shown this thing, and he also understood why. The grin that spread beneath his mask was big enough that even his bandages couldn't hide it, but he didn't care. Apparently these two aren't just spineless idiots, huh? I guess they might be useful after all. He reined his bloodlust in from one moment to the next. Well then, he said, silently gesturing for them to join him. What are you waiting for? This was as much a concession as he was willing to make, and they thankfully realized that as well. I didn't think it possible, but this mission actually just got even more interesting. Naruto and Haku were already training when Sasuke finally arrived, but he couldn't find it in him to feel bad for being late. He had other worries at the moment. Sasuke! Naruto called as soon as he saw him, stopping in the middle of his spar to beam at him and immediately regretting it when Haku's fist collided with his head. Don't take your eyes from your opponent, Naruto-kun. You will never win if you always get distracted this easily. Naruto gave Haku a betrayed look as he rubbed the spot where she had hit him. I don't get distracted. You only win because you are older than me. Haku chuckled. I'm afraid most enemies wouldn't hold back just because they are older than you, though. What are you gonna do? Surrender to every adult enemy shinobi you meet? Naruto didn't reply to that, choosing instead to turn around with a pouty scoff. This action, however, brought him face to face with Sasuke. Wow, you look like shit, Shut up, idiot. It was probably good that for all that Naruto tended to overreact and be overly emotional, he also knew when someone was rude only because they had a bad day. Sasuke was sure most of their friends from the academy would already feed up with him because of such a greeting alone. Damn, did something happen? You weren't in such a bad mood ever since Kiba Dash. We said we would never talk about that again. Before Naruto could reply, Haku intervened. Now, why don't you two calm down? There is no need to start a fight this early in the morning. She then turned specifically towards Sasuke. And why don't you tell us what's bothering you? Maybe we can help. Sasuke scoffed, but there was no heat behind it. You can't. Without saying anything further, he unceremoniously dropped to the ground. Nah, of course we can. Naruto exclaimed in his usual loud voice as he let himself fall down next to him and threw an arm over his shoulder, ignoring his murmured complaints at that action. That's what friends are there for, right Haku? The girl nodded as she sat down in front of them, her knees orderly arranged beneath her body. He's right. And even if we can't help directly, we can at least support you. He always found these mushy talks stupid and uncomfortable, even when they came from Itachi or his mother. It wasn't even that he disagreed with the sentiment or anything like that, he just found it weird. Why couldn't people say these things in a less cringy way? However, right now, he couldn't help but feel somewhat thankful for it. Nii-san went on another mission, he finally said with a downcast expression. He didn't say what it was, though. Not even to Ota-san and Kaa-san. There had been a number of occasions in the past where Itachi wouldn't tell him what his missions were about, no matter how much he begged. Sasuke wasn't stupid, however, and could guess that these missions were the kinds of which he found too brutal to tell him about, the kinds of which every child at the academy dreamed of going on one day. The thing was, Sasuke also knew that Itachi usually told their parents even if he didn't tell him. That he didn't do so this time must mean that it was something top secret he literally couldn't talk about. Probably also something very, very dangerous. Naruto looked a bit confused at his admission, but Haku immediately understood. Itachi Nii is very strong, she said gently. You know that. It probably isn't a solo mission either, so he has strong teammates to have his back with him as well. He will be fine, I promise. His mother had told him almost the exact same thing. However, he knew that she was just as worried as he was, even if he couldn't see any signs of it on her face or in her voice. And while his father at least hadn't appeared worried, he went straight to his study even though Sasuke knew that he had already finished all his duties for the day. He never did that other than when he tried to hide from the rest of their family. I know that, but what if Dash? Man, don't be stupid, Naruto interrupted him, his smile even wider than usual. Itachi is, like, super strong. He's even already a Jonin, right? Also, isn't he a prudy proggy wait, I got it. A prod dash. I think the word you're looking for is prodigy, Naruto-kun, Haku said gently with a note of amusement in her voice. Yes, that. Itachi is this super great prodigy, isn't he? That's what everyone in the village says anyway. He will totally kick ass on this mission, you just wait. It was clear that Naruto still didn't completely understand what was bothering Sasuke, but he did realize that he was worried about his brother and immediately jumped to console him. Sasuke knew that what they said was true, his brother was not only strong but in fact one of the strongest shinobi in the entire village. There were not many who could defeat him, especially when he had backup from other strong shinobi as well. He would probably be just fine. But wasn't he allowed to worry anyway? Alright, Haku spoke up when no one else said anything for several seconds. Sitting around and doing nothing won't help anyone. Let's continue with our training. Sasuke, didn't you mention a technique Shisui has taught you? Why don't you show it to us and we then think about how we can use it to beat Itachi Nii when he returns? He knew what she was trying to do, but he was thankful for the distraction nonetheless. Sure, let's do that. Yes. Naruto exclaimed. Let's go. I will totally beat you today, Sasuke. A small smirk crept up his face. Haven't I won the last 2 times? So what? I won the time before that. Well, I won dash. Haku interfered once again. Boys, less talking, and more fighting. Big words have yet to win an actual fight, you know. The two of them didn't need any more motivation than that to rush at each other. Izumi dropped her head onto the table in front of her with an audible thud, for once completely uncaring of what the other guests at the tea house might think of her. What are the odds that I return from my mission on the very same day he leaves for his? Rather than consoling her, Shisui just chuckled. This is hardly the first time something like this has happened, right? I thought you would be used to it by now. Her head snapped back up. Well, I'm not. Just because not having as much time to meet her friends as she would have liked had become somewhat of the norm over years didn't mean she must like it, after all. Besides, you only say that because you were here to see him off. Were it you who missed him instead of me, you would grumble about it for days. I wouldn't. That argument would have probably gotten out of hand as it so often did with the two of them, dragging their conversations regularly out for hours at a time, but fortunately, a waitress chose that moment to arrive with their orders. Anyway, Shisui continued more calmly once the woman had left as he took a sip from his tea. If you want to stop missing him and me as well, by the way this often, you should hurry and try to get promoted. Jonin don't necessarily have less missions than shinin, but at least you would qualify to join us on more of them than you do now. She sighed. I asked the Sandaime to let me participate in the Jonin exams, but he thinks I'm not ready yet. I guess I could try to get enough recommendations from other Jonin, but considering the Hokage has the final say regardless, that would probably not work either. It had honestly been stupid of her to even ask. Izumi was confident enough to call herself fairly talented, sure. She wasn't a prodigy like Itachi or Shisui, but she was still far above the average skill level of most shinobi. After all, becoming a chunin at an age at which people usually just graduated from the academy was an impressive feat, especially during peace times like these. However, Jonin were the elite of the elite. Even if you were talented, you usually couldn't become one without a lot of experience. Well, at least I'm here now, so I don't see what you have to complain about. She good naturally rolled her eyes. Keep telling yourself that if it makes you happy. His surprised stuttering that followed was enough to completely jolt herself out of her bad mood. After that, their conversation continued in a more light-hearted manner as they talked about the most recent gossip Might Guy had a parent started to cry about his eternal rival, leaving him behind without even saying goodbye after he had a few too many drinks, and rumors that were swirling around the village like the one that claimed Asuma Sarutobi would return to the village soon. It was nice and definitively a welcome respite from her last mission. That was the 8th cleanup mission at the northern border in a month. You would think the bandits in the area would have realized by now that they couldn't expect much success there and move on, but alas, they kept coming back. It almost made her miss the days when all she ever did was painting fences and hunt a stupid cat. Almost. However, there was something strange about Shisui. Izumi couldn't put her finger on it, but he seemed somehow more agitated than usual. More nervous. It took all the restraint she could muster to not pester him about what was going on in his head, but even then her thoughts continuously returned to his weird behavior. Weren't she worried it could be something serious? She would probably found it kinda adorable. By the way, Shisui said without quite meeting her eyes. Did you get an invitation to Dakijimi's birthday too? Izumi blinked at that unexpected topic and needed a second before she could reply. I actually did, yes. Kaa-san was really surprised. We apparently didn't even get invitations to it back when my father was still alive. Takijimi was probably their clan's most influential non-shinobi. He had held a high position in Konoha's merchant guild for over a decade now, and more recently, in the wake of the purge of the civilian leadership that happened after it came out that many of them had allied with the member of the 12 Guardian Ninja that had tried to overthrow Konoha, he had risen even higher. In fact, he had become its head just a few short months ago. Only the most important and influential members of their clan were invited to that man's birthday party, which obviously meant Izumi's family had never been there before. That made the fact that she was actually invited this year completely unexpected. Her mother theorized that it had something to do with the higher UPS finally acknowledging her talent, though her friendship with Itachi and Shisui probably helped as well. Great. Shisui exclaimed maybe a tad too loudly with a wide grin as he briefly met her eye before quickly looking elsewhere once again. So the old geezer finally realized that you're really talented, huh? Certainly took him long enough. She snorted. I can't say I really care about what he thinks about me, but it's nice to be acknowledged, I guess. Anyway, Shisui continued, and Izumi thought she could see his cheeks growing red. I thought we could go there together. The question left her completely speechless. Was that what had made him act so strangely all day? Although she didn't really know what she was going to say herself quite yet, Izumi opened her mouth to reply only for Shisui to continue without looking at her at an ever-increasing pace. These kinds of events are always pretty boring, so I thought it would be more interesting if you went with someone you like, you know? To have some fun and stuff. And at least we would have someone with whom we could laugh at all the pompous people that are usually there, right? Time flies when you have fun, so the entire thing would at least be over in an instant instead of stretching for dash. Shisui, she interrupted him with a small smile, ignoring the heat she could feel creeping up her own face. Are you asking me on a date? Well, I guess I do. Though we can go just as friends too if dash. I would love to, she blurted out. Going there with you, I mean. Going by the honest surprise on his face, he obviously hadn't expected her to say yes. Really? He shook his head. No, I mean that's great. Yeah. They looked at each other in silence for a few moments, neither of them knowing how to continue from there. Fortunately, Shisui found his voice first. So, he said slowly. The party is on Friday at 8 in the evening. I guess I will be at your house, 7:45, then. Maybe make that 7:30 instead, she said a bit uncertainly. You know, so we don't need rush or anything. Sure, he immediately agreed. That makes sense. Great. Yeah. Although the atmosphere was rather awkward, Izumi couldn't stop the smile that was spreading on her face, and considering Shisui did too, she assumed he felt the same. Honestly, she would have never expected him to ask her on a date. Like, seriously? Shisui? For all that a lot of girls found him handsome and even had approached him in the past, she didn't think he ever went out with any of them. And now he had asked her on a date. Izumi couldn't help it, she laughed. Many other guys might have been offended by that, thinking that she laughed about them, but Shisui understood her. She didn't need to explain what was so funny first for him to get it, and in fact, his laughter soon joined in with hers. It took Itaki and his team 9 days, but now they had almost reached their destination. After the initial bad start between them and Zabuza, he and Kakashi had been surprised to see that the swordsman was both courteous and cooperative. Or something close to it, at least. That didn't mean that he agreed with everything they said or that he didn't argue, of course, but if you ignored his gruff personality and dark humor, he was almost friendly. As Itaki had dealt with Kisame for many years, he could handle Zabuza's comments with ease. Kakashi lacked such experience, but he had apparently handled enough eccentric and unpleasant people himself to not be bothered by Zabuza either, meaning there was no problem from his front as well. Thus, the journey was unexpectedly stress-free. Furthermore, Zabuza had also been willing to share some of his insight into his former colleagues, so Itaka could call the last few days even productive. Itaka wondered if part of the reason he was so cooperative stemmed from his little demonstration right to the beginning of their journey when he and Kakashi had caught up with him. He had assumed that Zabuza was similar to Kisame in that he only respected strength and had acted accordingly to that. There were no atrocities to his name in this timeline, but he still regained the memories of his past and thus could call upon the emotions he had felt during the time. Itaka was the first to admit that he hadn't been in a healthy state of mind during, after, and even shortly before the Uchiha massacre. His mind and heart had been plunged into darkness, madness even, and only the macabre thought of one day dying at his own brother's hand had kept him going. There were lots of shinobi who were a bit mad regardless of name or rank. It was almost normal in their profession. However, what truly mattered was how you dealt with it. Itaki hadn't dealt with it at all. At least not at first, and certainly not for the first few years after the massacre. He had once read a line from a famous poet that was said to have lived only shortly after the Sage of Six Paths: whoever fights with monsters should see to it that he does not become a monster in the process. And when you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. Itaki had become a monster. While his original intentions might arguably have been good, whatever that might mean in this world of theirs, there was no arguing that the acts of kinslaying and mass murder were evil. He had not only looked into the abyss but jumped into it head first. He had eventually pulled himself out of it, but the memories remained, and a man like Zabuza could see its signs when they weren't carefully hidden. Apparently, it had been enough to convince him of working with rather than against them. Anyway, back to the present. While their journey so far had indeed gone unexpectedly well, that wasn't to say that everything was perfect. In fact, even with the welcome advantage of improved cooperation between the three of them, the situation was actually rather grim. The problem was that the aide they had been supposed to meet yesterday hadn't arrived yet. It wasn't completely unreasonable to assume that they were simply late. After all, there could be all kinds of delays for a group of shinobi that were traveling all the way from the land of water this deep into the continent. What was unreasonable, however, was that neither Itaka's crows nor Kakashi's dogs were able to find any trace of them. Even when their team decided to stay at the designated meeting place for a day to wait for them while also giving the summons more time for their search, they weren't able to find anything. The only fight their group had so far happened the day after that, when Kakashi and he proposed to return in reaction to this development while Zabuza insisted on continuing with just the three of them. Unfortunately, the man stubbornly resisted any logic and even claimed that he would go on by himself if necessary, leaving the two of them no choice but to continue the journey as well. Unlikable as he might be, he was their comrade for the duration of the mission. Kakashi and Itaka both were unwilling to leave him behind. Besides, there was also the fact Kirigakure might take badly to them leaving the last of the 7 swordsmen behind by himself, especially if it got him killed. It didn't matter that they were theoretically in the right or that Zabuza was the one who acted stupid and reckless. If he died, they would be blamed. All they could do was to follow him while also sending one of Itaka's crows back to Konoha with a message to inform the Hokage about this development. "I smell blood and rotten flesh." Pulled back to reality by Kakashi's voice, Itaka turned towards his fellow Konohanin. "From where?" "Northwest," he said while nodding in the relevant direction before furrowing his brows. "I don't think it's fresh, but I can't be sure." Zabuza snorted. "Well, isn't that a useful ability? Seems like we already got a lead." "This might be dash." The swordsman didn't let him finish. "A trap, I know. I'm not stupid, and that lanky bastard Kushimaru always loved these funny little traps of his. It's still a lead, though, and if this is really their work, it happened much more recent than anything else we know of. This would be our freshest lead and it would be stupid to ignore it, am I right?" Itaka and Kakashi looked at each other before the latter decided to speak. "You are, yes. However, while it's great that all of us realize the potential danger, it would still be prudent to talk about how we will proceed if this is indeed a trap." Zabuza didn't look as if he agreed, but unexpectedly, he swallowed his complaints down. "Fair enough," he said. "I guess it would be pretty embarrassing to die by one of that idiot's traps." He crossed his muscular arms in front of his chest. "All right, what do you suggest?" Chapter 33, Swordsman of the Mist 3. Let's start this from the beginning. Swordsman of the Mist 3. As it turned out, the smell of blood and rotten flesh came from the remains of a nearby town. At first glance, one might be forgiven for thinking there was nothing wrong with the place. No buildings were destroyed, nothing was burned down, and even some carts were still standing on the street as if their owner had just left them there for a minute to go get something and would be back any moment now. However, once one took a closer look, things started to appear much more sinister. Caskets at the side of the road were knocked over with their content lying on the ground beside them, doors were not just open but literally kicked out of their hinges, and the dusty ground showed signs of many people hurriedly running into the same direction at the same time. Much more importantly, it was silent. Even in a small town like this, there should be at least some background noises. Although it probably shouldn't be that surprising considering there were yet to be any people or even animals to be seen. When even rats and birds kept away from a place where they could find easy food, you knew something was very, very wrong. Itaka was just as aware as his two companions what sight would almost be guaranteed to await them once they walked deeper into the town, but it was still disheartening when they found the first pool of dried, black blood. From then on, such things became more common, and soon the corpses of various animals, from horses to cats and dogs, joined next to splattered blood at the walls. While that was no definite proof, these things, and the fact that a quick check showed that nothing appeared to have been stolen meant the likelihood of their targets being responsible was very high. After all, bandits raided towns like this to steal their valuables or to take prisoners. Even if they were cruel enough to commit such atrocities, they wouldn't do it and then leave behind anything valuable. Things got even worse when they finally reached what probably had once been the marketplace. So I guess this explains why there hadn't been any corpses so far, huh? Zabuza sounded casual, almost bored, as he pointed at the mountain of corpses that piled up in the center of the round plaza. Seems like Kushimaru and Jinin had way too much free time. They might enjoy killing, but I can't remember them ever bothering to put their prizes to show in such a manner. It was necessary to analyze the scene of crimes rationally and calmly, he knew that, but Itaka couldn't help but think that the swordsman was a bit too unbothered by the scene. It was one thing to not be deterred by such things, but to not even care at all. The demon of the hidden mist indeed. However, he didn't voice any of these thoughts. Now wasn't the time to sow dissent between them. Maybe it's just me, Kakashi said as he observed the scene with much more gravity than Zabuza. But I don't think the number of corpses is enough to include every inhabitant of this town. He's right, Itaka thought with furrowed brows as he took a closer look at the pile himself. No, they don't. However, none of the reports we have indicates that they have taken prisoners. So either some inhabitant could escape, the remaining corpses are elsewhere, our reports are lacking, or someone else is responsible for this. Kakashi looked at each other for a moment, both silently realizing that the first possibility was almost impossible. Zabuza, Itaka then said, turning towards the man who had decided to walk towards the pile to take a closer look at it. What do you dash? Unfortunately, before he could finish his sentence, he was distracted by something sparkling from next to Zabuza's left foot. His brain had barely time to realize that it was the reflection of the sun on some wire strings that he saw before his legs pushed off the ground to get as much distance between himself and the plaza. Half a second later, a powerful explosion tore the pile of corpses apart and shook the ground with such strength that some of the nearby houses collapsed. Itaka appeared on the roof of a building just outside the radius of the distraction and was almost immediately joined by Kakashi and Zabuza to his right and left respectively. As an injury this early into their mission would have been problematic, he was glad to note that neither was hurt. Well, Zabuza said after a few seconds of silence during which he brushed the dust off his clothes. I guess I can see at least Kushimaru putting the effort in to arrange all these corpses if it's to set a trap like this. Might even find it amusing to use the bodies of those he has killed to kill some more, that bastard. That doesn't explain the lack of bodies, though. As if reading his mind, Kakashi turned towards the Kirinin. And can you also think of a reason for either of them to take prisoners? The man shrugged. One or two, yes, but I doubt it matters. In all likelihood, they just allowed them to run away to then later hunt them down for sports. Deciding that they wouldn't find a better explanation for now, Itaka changed the topic. No matter their reasoning, it's apparent that they're getting bolder. If this was truly them, and we have currently no solid evidence either way, then it shows that they feel safe enough to be more open with their attacks. Kakashi nodded. And as nothing we know indicates that they're foolish to the point of overconfidence. Then we must assume that they have a way to escape any possible pursuer if push comes to shove. Zabuza looked at them both for a moment before he suddenly snorted. Good deduction, he said sarcastically. But you seem to overlook a direct consequence of your conclusion. Itaka narrowed his eyes. And what consequence would that be? He couldn't see it, but he was sure that Zabuza was grinning like a madman beneath his bandages. Tell me, if they're so confident in their abilities to avoid confrontations if necessary, what's stopping them from escalating their little attacks more and more? He and Kakashi needed a second to realize what the other man was implying, but when they did, their eyes simultaneously widened. Don't tell me. Zabuza looked almost smug at Kakashi's shock. What a funny coincidence that the seat of this nation's daimyo is just a day's walk from here, isn't it? It appeared their mission just got a lot more complicated. Although she was no longer chained, she knew that there was no hope of escaping her captivity. Even if her legs weren't mostly useless, and even if the pain in her back that brought her to tears when she made as much as a single false move wouldn't exist, there was just no way of actually running from her captors. No, they would just catch her once again and then punish her for her stupidity. Besides, where should she run to? There was after all no home she could return to left. And even if she had, would her family even want her back now that she was like this? Another wave of pain surging through her body made her groan as she put her head deeper into her hands. No, not hands, but claws. That thought made her sob. Not only had they killed everyone she ever cared about and tortured her for Kami knew how long, but they had also taken her own body away from her. Her hands, once small and smooth except for the one scar she got when she was 6, were now brown, scaly claws twice as big as her hands had ever been with 10-centimeter long nails that were hard as steel. There were 2 big bumps on her back just out of her reach that made it impossible to lean against the wall or even sit straight due to the way they pushed against her spine. 2 small, curved horns spun from her forehead like those of the demons she had seen drawings of in fantasy books. And her once straight teeth had become bigger and more pointed to the point where she couldn't close her mouth anymore without them sinking into her own flesh. At this point, she was confident that she was more monster than human. However, these things she could at least ignore somewhat. The pain, on the other hand, was an ever-present companion she just couldn't turn out. The various deformations of her body was merely a dull throbbing that occasionally shot a hot wave of agony through her veins, but the other thing was much, much worse. She didn't know what it was, but it felt like a colony of fire ants that traveled beneath her skin. The itchy sensation seared her flesh without actually burning it and never stayed long at one spot, traveling all over her body instead. It slowly drove her crazy, and her legs proved that no amount of scratching brought her any relief. She had literally ripped them apart with her claws, first in hopes of smoothing the itching and then later in an attempt to get whatever caused the sensation out of her body, but with no avail. If this wasn't hell, then she didn't know what was. Please, she prayed to all the gods she knew. I beg you, any of you, please save me. They had no real proof that Kushimaru and Jinin would truly target the daimyo, but the fact that the possibility existed was more than enough for them to rush towards the capital of the Land of Waterfalls. While the distance between that and the town they had found themselves in would usually take a day to cross, they would be able to reach the city in a quarter of that time if they hurried. However, Zabuza's reasoning for wanting to reach the capital was quite different from his and Kakashi's. He just wanted to be there before the other 2 swordsmen launched their attack because that was the easiest way of getting to fight them, while they wanted to do so because the well-being of the daimyo was of actual importance to Konoha. The Land of Waterfalls had traditionally been more closely affiliated to Konohagakure than to Iwagakure ever since the founding of the villages, though the fact that it had been Iwa who violated their borders first during the last war meant they had grown closer to Konoha than ever before since the end of the war. In fact, they even allowed Konohanin to travel through their lands mostly unhindered. That and the small garrison kept in the nation were essential in keeping a close eye on the land of Earth. It was unclear what consequences the death of the daimyo would have on this alliance, but it was no secret that Takigakure wasn't happy with Konoha's presence within their nation. Should the next daimyo be swayed by them, Konoha might lose this important foothold. Considering its hidden village had never been conquered before, demonstrating its worth as a buffer between Konoha and Iwa, that would indeed be a hard blow. As it turned out, however, they wouldn't even need to travel all the way to the capital to find their targets. All 3 of them noticed the chakra signatures simultaneously and stopped as one. A second later, hundreds of water needles flew at them from every direction. Katon, Hibashiri. Fire release, running fire. Itaka was the first one to react, running through hand seals in the blink of an eye and creating a protective flame barrier around himself and his allies, vaporizing the little needles with its heat before they could hit them. The short reprieve he had given them allowed Kakashi to go through hand seals of his own, and the moment Itaka's fire extinguished, he jumped into the air and spun around his own axis to throw his attack in every direction as well. Raiten, Kanden Haribari. Lightning release, electric shock needles. Unfortunately, there were no cries of pain or any other indication that the attack had actually hit someone. What it did, however, was giving the 3 of them the chance to reorganize and prepare themselves, resulting in them jumping to the ground from the tree branch they had been standing on and positioning themselves in a triangle with their backs to each other. Itaki had just enough time to think that at least they were lucky enough to be fighting in a forest where the trees were far apart and the canopy let in a lot of light before he noticed the thick fog rolling towards them in waves from everywhere. "Kirigaku no jutsu," Kakashi murmured from his left. "That was to be expected, I guess." Zabuza snorted, sounding simultaneously amused and annoyed. "It has been a while since I was the one on the other end of this technique. Not sure whether I should look forward to this or be pissed that they think the silent killing technique could possibly work against me." That was actually their greatest advantage. While their enemies were doubtlessly masters of this fighting style, so was Zabuza. With him on their side, Kushimaru and Jinin would need to be much more careful in their approach. That was obviously a problem, as well as this made them even more dangerous as a result, but as it also gave Itaki and his team more opportunities to counter them, he thought it was a good deal. It was a shame that their opponent knew the danger Zabuza posed as well. Itaki's own familiarity with the fighting style might help as well. While Kisame preferred a more straightforward way of fighting, he did use it on occasion to amuse himself. Itaki was far from an expert, but thanks to that, he could predict at least some of their moves. Their only warning of the incoming attack was a roaring whoosh that became deafening loud within seconds, making all three of them jump away a mere moment before a gigantic water dragon crashed into the ground where they had stood a heartbeat earlier. The next thing Itaki knew was that he found himself standing all alone in the middle of the mist with no trace of his teammates to be found. The very moment his feet touched the ground, Zabuza was already on the move again to dodge the incoming slash of an axe. The weapon swung a centimeter past his face, close enough for him to feel a breeze, but he ignored that and instead swung Kubikari Basho in the direction he suspected his opponent to be, cursing under his breath when all he hit was empty air. Then he was forced to jump away again when he felt an incoming attack from above, resulting in the hammer blowing away the ground to his feet rather than smashing his head. His own counter once again slashed only air. "It was smart of you to separate us, Jinin," he said into the void of the mist. "Really clever. Didn't think you two had it in you. But you don't really think you can kill me like this, do you?" As every shinobi, he was prepared to die at any moment. Zabuza had long since realized that his life would take a violent end one day and was at peace with that. However, there was no way he would allow himself to be killed by his own trademark technique. The next time he felt an incoming attack, he fell into a crouch and waved hand seals instead of swinging his sword again. Sutin, Swibin. Water release, water whip. Spinning around his own axis just like the copy ninja had done earlier, his water whip twirled around him and expanded into every direction. Jinin might be just as proficient in sneaking through the mist soundlessly as he was, going even so far as to allow him to stay undetected even by Zabuza, but there were ways to force someone to make a sound whether they liked it or not. The splashing sound of water when something cut through his whip was all he needed to swing around and jump to his right. When he brought his sword down the next time, it was the sound of metal clashing on metal that rang through the mist. "There you are," he said as his excitement rose. "And now I'm not letting you get away again." Jinin possessed immense offensive powers, there was no doubt about that. Zabuza wouldn't even be surprised if that man could break Kubikari Basho with one of his attacks. Thus, the best way to proceed was to force him into a defensive position where that strength didn't matter, and that was exactly what he did. He swung his sword in a wide arc, forcing Jinin to duck beneath it where he was promptly greeted by a foot to his face. Using his opponent's momentarily stunned state, he then quickly rushed forward and swung Kubikari Basho over his head, directing it down towards Jinin with enough power to tear him apart in one attack. That attack unfortunately missed when his opponent jumped to the side and ended up destroying the ground instead. Not being deterred in the slightest, he jumped after him, depriving Jinin of the chance to gather himself. The other man hurriedly threw his axe at him in a fruitless effort to keep him away that Zabuza thwarted with a mere tilt of his head, letting the weapon fly past him without even making him slow down. He then flicked Kubikari Basho upwards in a straight line before using Jinin's unstable stance that was a result of his clumsy dodge to drove his elbow into his stomach. Zabuza intended to decapitate him then and there but was unfortunately forced to back down when Jinin pulled at the leather strap that connected his weapons to bring the axe he had previously thrown back towards him, almost decapitating him instead. That short break in his offensive was enough to make Jinin regain his stance and swing his hammer at him with a low growl. Twisting Kubikaraibisho just in time to use it as a shield, Zabuza groaned when the strength of the attack pushed him several feet backwards. However, other than that, the attack did him no harm. No, the true problem that came from this short exchange was that Jinan was now the one on the offense while Zabuza was on the defense. He dodged the following axe strike with a one-handed flick-flack backwards, during which he also swung his sword in hopes of regaining his momentum, but Kubikaraibisho was simply pushed aside by the hammer while the axe continued to fly at him from every direction. This was the one downside of his weapon. While his attacks with it were powerful, it was too unhandy to allow his moving around unhindered. Zabuza had learned to compensate for that, of course, but the problem was that Jinan was there when he had learned many of his tricks. Thus, none of them were effective in once again turning the tides. All Zabuza could do right now was to wait and dodge until an opportunity presented itself. The thing was, he didn't like waiting. Not one bit. He could do it if the situation demanded it, but preferred to find a way that made it unnecessary. Right now, he didn't see why he should wait and see when there were other possibilities. Sure, his plan was risky, but in his experience, it were those kinds of plans that brought the greatest rewards. With that in mind, the next time Jinan brought his axe down on him, he held the flat side of his sword upwards with one hand at each end to block it. The clash made shockwaves run down his arms and pushed his feet into the ground, but Zabuza knew the true attack was still to come. Jinan brought his hammer down a second later, striking the back of his axe that was still pushed against Kubikaraibisho and with a loud crack breaking it in two. Just as Zabuza had planned. Instead of jumping back in panic like his opponent had surely anticipated, he took one step to the left. Ignoring the shallow cut he received on his right shoulder as a result of that, he grabbed with his left hand for the circular cut out of Kubikaraibisho's top half that was still flying through the air, caught it, and then proceeded to slam it into Jinan's throat with a satisfying splatting noise. That satisfaction faded into thin air when the body dissolved into a puddle of water a moment later. Kakashi had pulled up his forehead protector almost immediately after the first attack had been launched, but in the thick mist, his Sharingan didn't help him as much as he would have liked it to. It might give him an advantage if his opponent came close, but other than that, it wasn't any better than a normal eye right now. Considering he would prefer to keep his enemy at distance or at least be the one that initiated the fight, that was a problem. His sight severely limited, fighting an opponent that specialized in killing without making a sound, and entirely separated from his team. Yes, Kakashi was in a very tricky situation indeed. And of course they were smart enough to take precautions to eliminate their smell as well, he thought with an inward sigh. However, the fact that their opponents put so much weight on moving silently also gave him an advantage. After all, if there was no chance of hearing them anyway, there was no reason for Kakashi and his team to remain silent. "Itake," he called just as the sounds of a fight began to ring in the distance. "Can you hear me?" Unfortunately, there was no reply. Kakashi was just about to call for Zabuza as well when the whizzing sound of something flying through the air rang from behind him, making him duck reflexively. A second later, an object that looked like an oversized needle flew over his head. So that's the legendary sword Nuiberi, huh? It wasn't the weapon itself that caught most of his attention, though, but what was flying behind it. It appears that Zabuza was right when he told us about his comrade's tendency to use ninja wire. Then the weapon was flying at him again, now coming straight at him. However, this time, he was prepared. Rather than dodging again, Kakashi instead waited until the weapon was close enough for him to see before catching it. Not wasting any time, he immediately pulled on it with all his strength and was shortly afterwards rewarded when a figure fell from a nearby tree. Kakashi only realized that he had been tricked when the kunai he threw at it hit a wooden trunk rather than a human. Even worse, the noise of his own attack almost drowned out the sound of something flying at him from behind again, resulting in him receiving a gash on his shoulder when he just barely dodged the needle before it could pierce his heart. Then Kushimaru, for that was obviously his opponent, apparently decided to make serious, for Kakashi suddenly found himself continuously dodging attacks from all directions simultaneously. Kunai and shuriken flew at him from his right, shortly followed by water needles from his left that stopped him from throwing something back in that direction to block them. Nuiberi flew at him from behind, while a hail of senbons came from in front of him. Kakashi found himself unable to stay at one place for longer than half a second without being under constant attack from all directions. The most annoying thing was that at some point two needle-like swords began flying towards him at once. While certainly annoying, Kakashi knew that Nuibari didn't come as a set and thus could at least confirm his suspicion that Kushimaru was using a clone technique to attack him simultaneously from several directions. However, the longer this cat-and-mouse chase continued, the more insight Kakashi gained into his opponent. First, Kushimaru was cautious. For all that he was by all accounts a cruel man, he didn't rush at him without restraint. No, he instead continued to attack Kakashi from a safe distance to wear him down until he would be easy prey. Second, there was a muster to his attacks. Kushimaru always went first for his head, then for his heart, and finally for his lungs. There were occasional small deviations in that order, of course, and when Kakashi intentionally left an opening in his defense, Kushimaru tried to use that as well. Nonetheless, his attacks started to become predictable to Kakashi. Third, while there were usually only attacks from two directions at most, there were never more than four either. Even when they came at him from all directions at once, many of the thrown objects showed signs of not having been thrown in a straight line. Thus, Kakashi deduced that there were indeed only 3 clones in addition to the original. I see, he thought. In that case, I can. Kakashi's eyes widened as he came to a sudden stop, his throat mere millimeters away from a metal wire that would have decapitated him had he continued on his path. That wasn't the thing that caught him the most off guard, though. That honor went to the corpse of a middle-aged man that leaned against a tree to his right, whose clothes were mostly burned away and that had dark marks spanning all over his torso. Or more specifically, the man's forehead protector. A shinobi from Takigaku? What? Kushimaru, obviously taking advantage of the fact that Kakashi was momentarily stumbled, threw Nuibari at him again. The sword missed his head by a hair, and when he wanted to hurry away, he found himself face to face with another wall of wires. It was then that he realized that the only direction where no wires stopped his path was the one he came from. Naturally, it was from there that a hail of shuriken flew at him a second later. It took every ounce of agility he possessed to bend his body in a way that allowed him to dodge all those projectiles, leaning backwards until his hands touched the ground and with one leg twisted over the other. A moment later, he was helpless to do anything when Nuibari flew down at him from a nearby tree and pierced his heart. It was half a heartbeat later when the clone puffed out of existence and the real Kakashi that was hiding in the underground gained his memories that he knew it was time to implement his plan. He and 3 of his clones swam through the ground until they were below the positions he had concluded the various versions of Kushimaru to be before they all at once emerged from it in an explosion of dirt and dust, lightning crackling in their hands. It was impossible to read their opponent's mimic as he wore a mask, but going by their body language, all 4 of them would have found themselves face to face with an expression of shock as their hands pierced their hearts, similarly to how the man's weapon had pierced his clones shortly before. Much as Kakashi had expected, 3 of the bodies immediately dissolved into water. However, he quickly realized the danger he was in when the 4th body too dissolved into nothing more than a puddle. Damn it, he thought as the muscles in his legs tensed, preparing to carry him away. This is a trap. Then, before he had a chance to do anything else, the sound of wire being cut rang through the mist, and a second later, everything around him, from trees to rocks, was cut to pieces as the metal wire tore through them. It was obvious that their opponents wanted to separate them. Not only were they easier picking that way, Kushimaru and Jinin would also want to keep Kakashi and him away from Zabuza, as they probably thought he would be the hardest to kill. Itaki understood that logic, and he also realized that the odds of finding his teammates in this mist were slim to non-existent. Thus, and knowing that his usual techniques and methods wouldn't work, he decided to do something unexpected. Rather than searching for his team or waiting for his opponents to attack him first, he ran. Unpredictability was always one of the most effective abilities a shinobi could have. As soon as he began to rush away, weapons began to fly at him. However, while every experienced shinobi would recognize that for all that these projectiles were thrown with great skill and precision, Itaka saw that they were also used hurriedly. Rather than trying to push him into a certain direction or distract him from another, more powerful attack, there was no other intention to them other than to stop Itaki in his tracks. Therefore, Itaka concluded that he had caught his opponent off guard just as he had hoped he would. He ran for only about 3 minutes or so before stopping. long enough to hopefully get some distance between himself and his teammates wherever they might be while also remaining close enough to potentially find them later. Then he waited. It was barely 5 seconds later that he felt eyes on the back of his head. The 7 swordsmen were masters of the silent killing technique. They could move through the mist without making any noises and still find their enemies with ease, erase their very presence until not even the most talented shinobi could sense them, and kill their opponents so quickly that they didn't even realize they had died before their bodies collapsed. However, they were still just humans. They made mistakes. Unfortunately for them, people were the most likely to make mistakes when they were flustered and caught off guard. The sensation lasted only a split second, but it was enough to tell Itachi his opponent's position. Spinning around in an instant, he formed hand seals faster than the normal eye could track. A moment later, the man in the tree 24 meters away from Itachi saw a large fireball fly towards him. That was only an illusion, however. Rather than a fire release technique, the hand seals were for a mid-level, large-scale genjutsu. It wasn't as strong as one powered by his Sharingan, but considering he couldn't even see his opponent through all the mist, it was the best he could do. He quickly formed hand seals again, and this time, the fireball he shot was very real. Katon, Gokakyu no Jutsu. Fire release, great fireball technique. Itachi appeared on a branch of the burning tree a moment later, only to find a distinctive lack of a corpse. He was confident he had hit a body, though, and his genjutsu hadn't been broken, so. A clone, he thought. Which means the original. Before he could finish the thought, his instincts screamed at him to move, so he did. Jumping from the tree, he landed on the ground just as the sword he recognized as Nuibari cut off the branch he had stood on. The attack didn't stop there, however. The moment he touched the ground, he was already on the move again to avoid dozens of projectiles of all kinds. Not letting that stop him, he formed hand seals for yet another large-scale illusion. Using the same trick twice was usually ill-advised, but in this case, Itachi bet on the fact that his opponent wouldn't think him foolish enough to try such a thing. After all, something usually stupid could actually be very effective when it managed to surprise an enemy. Unfortunately, he felt a backlash from his genjutsu being broken shortly after. Because of that, he momentarily felt lightheaded and didn't see the needle-like sword flying at him until it was almost too late, leading to him being cut on his cheek when he tilted his head out of the way at the last possible moment. In the following minutes, Itachi jumped around and twisted his body in 100 different ways to dodge the onslaught of attacks while making sure to not stay at the same spot for too long, knowing that would result in him being trapped. Kushimaru was known for his traps, after all, especially in conjuncture with ninja wire. That wasn't what he was concentrating on the most, however. Instead, he thought about how his opponent had managed to escape his genjutsu that quickly. Even when not created with his Sharingan, all his illusions were exceptionally powerful. It shouldn't be that easy to break them, not even for a shinobi of Kushimaru's caliber. Furthermore, his first attempt had worked just fine, so why not the second one as well? Even the effect of surprise didn't make that much of a difference. The best explanation he could come up with was that Kushimaru must have created a clone that kept out of Itachi's range and kept an eye on the original's chakra. Then, when it noticed Kushimaru being affected by genjutsu, it could intervene and release the illusion. Alternatively, it was even more likely that it was the original that stayed back while a clone did the more dangerous job of staying close and attacking Itachi. If true, that would certainly be very annoying. The longer the fight lasted, the more he began to understand his opponent's movements. However, the same was true the other way as well. In all likelihood, it would be Kushimaru who got the drop on him first and catch him with one of his traps simply because he held the more favorable position. While he could hide in the mist and attack from the distance, Itachi wasn't doing much more than dodging and jumping around. He needed to change that. If he could find out the clone's location, he could from there predict the originals as well because he needed to be close enough to be in a position where he could help his clone if needed. His decision made, Itachi drew several kunai with attached paper bombs from the weapon pouch at his leg and threw them while spinning in a circle. Then, using the short reprieve of attacks as well as the sight and noise barrier the explosions provided, he quickly bit his thumb and went through a new set of hand seals. Kuki-yose no Jutsu. Summoning technique. A murder of crows appeared and immediately flew high into the sky. The attacks continued shortly afterwards, but this time Itaka wasn't just trying to merely survive. No, he was waiting for his chance to attack. This chance came when the cawing of a crow could be heard from his left. Itaka jumped around without hesitation and created 2 crow clones, one on each side of him, before rushing in the direction his crow had pointed him as fast as he could while his clones spread out a bit further to the sides. Even if Kushimaru tried to escape, one of them would surely catch him. The first silhouette appeared quickly, standing at the top of a big tree from which he could coordinate his attacks easily. Seeing him and his clones approaching fast, Kushimaru flew through hand seals and slightly lifted his mast before a powerful water stream shot from his mouth. Itaka didn't need to do anything as one of his clones moved in front of him immediately. Using him as a springboard, Itaka jumped high into the air where his other clone was already waiting, allowing him to use that one to propel himself directly at his opponent. Kushimaru didn't even get the chance to raise his sword before Itaka cut off his head. Naturally, just as Itaka had predicted, the body dissolved into a puddle of water shortly after and thus proved his previous theory right. Not stopping there, he rushed on, once again guided by the cawing from one of his crows. As it turned out, the original Kushimaru had been more focused on getting away than on trying to stop Itaka, so when he appeared in front of him, he was barely able to evade the kunao that would have cut his neck. Not wanting to give up the initiative, Itaka followed up with a roundhouse kick which Kushimaru ducked beneath. Dodging the following thrust with Nuiberi with a tilt of his head, Itaka then closed in on him and drove his knee into his stomach before going for the kill with the kunao in his hand. Kushimaru avoided that with a flick-flack during which he sent a kick at Itaka-chin that missed him only by a hair. The short break this created was enough for his opponent to get his footing back, meaning the next swing of his sword was much more controlled and thus much more dangerous. He blocked the first slash with his kunao and dodged the second one before he fell into a crouch and tried to sweep Kushimaru's legs away with one smooth attack. The swordsman simply jumped a bit into the air, though, and then tried to ram his sword downwards through Itaka's abdomen. Having expected that, Itaka twisted out of the way and pushed himself into the air with his hands before landing on the handle of Nuiberi, ramming it into the ground and consequently rendering the weapon useless for Kushimaru when Itaka tried to slash his throat again. However, instead of either backing away or trying to regain his weapon as Itaka had thought he would, Kushimaru grabbed both his wrists with one hand each. Furthermore, he didn't even let him go when Itaka kicked both his legs against his chest. The reason for that became clear shortly after when his legs broke through the man's body and rather than broken bones and blood, all that covered his legs was water. It's another water clone, he realized as his eyes widened in surprise. So I was fighting a clone all this time? Where then is the original? Anyway, he couldn't solve more than one problem at a time and first needed to concentrate on escaping the clone that still held his wrists before he could do anything else. The fact that it was still able to fight even with a hole in its chest meant that Kushimaru must have used an enormous amount of chakra, but even such clones were far from indestructible. It was a second later that he understood why the clone was trying to keep him in place, however. Before he had a chance to do anything else, a clinging sound rang through the mist, and suddenly metal wire was rushing at him from every direction. Chapter 34, Swordsman of the Mist 4. Let's start this from the beginning. Swordsman of the Mist 4. Itaka knew that he had at most only a few seconds before he would be cut into pieces, so he acted fast. Pulling his legs upwards, he wrapped them around the water clone's arms that still held him before twisting his entire body, his chakra-enhanced strength ripping the limbs apart with a loud splash. Then, while still falling headfirst towards the ground, he used his newly freed hands to fly through half a dozen hand seals in the blink of an eye. Doton, Moguragaku or no Jutsu. Earth release, hiding like a mole technique. He disappeared beneath the ground just in time to avoid the deadly trap. The metal wire was closing in on him fast and Kakashi was more than aware that he would die if he didn't find a way out. Jumping high into the air was an option, but if he did that, a lot would depend on luck. After all, once in the air, there wasn't anything he could do to change his mind or even dodge an incoming attack. Blocking the wire was out of the question as well because the odds of it just cutting through anything he could possibly use to do so were too high. So, if he couldn't jump into the air and couldn't stay where he was either, there was only one way to go. Kakashi rushed through hand seals while falling into a crouch. Doton, Tsukakero. Earth release, Earth corridor. This technique usually caused the earth to rise up and trap a target between it, but all it took was a simple adjustment to make the earth below him fall instead, allowing him to escape the incoming attack that way. Kakashi smashed his hands on the ground to initiate the technique and felt the floor give way beneath him just when the wire arrived, managing to cut open his back before he could entirely vanish into the safety of the underground. The closer she came to Konoha, the more excited Anko got. It had been a bit over 6 years since the last time she had laid eyes upon her home, 6 years since she had last talked with her friends. Or anyone else who wasn't a snake, for that matter. However, after all this time, she was now finally on her way back. Before the end of the week, she would be able to walk the streets of her youth once again. Wow, that made her sound old. Scratch that, she thought. How about walking half-forgotten paths once again, instead? Damn, that even sounds poetic. Yeah, let's go with that. Anyway, it was late already and no matter how much she wanted to arrive at her destination, she didn't see the point in missing out on a good night's rest. Going through the necessary hand seals with ease, she summoned Aida. As usual, the dark blue snake appeared in a puff of smoke, his large body forming a protective barrier around her entire camp. It's dinner time, boy, she said while getting a fire started on which she could cook some food. I hope you have already eaten because there is no way I'm gonna be able to dash. That was the moment she turned around and actually looked at her companion. Hey, what's up with that stupid face? Most people would naturally struggle to recognize emotions in a snake's expression, but for Anko who had lived in Ryokai Cave with nothing but snakes for over a year, that wasn't much of a problem. Aida was probably the most well-mannered and mild-tempered snake she had ever met. However, if that were all that was to him, she wouldn't have taken such a liking to him. No, while these traits made it indeed easier to cooperate with him, it was his dry humor that drew her towards him. It reminded her a bit of Itachi, honestly. She had spent a lot of time with him during her training and even summoned him every single evening ever since she set off from Ryokai Cave, which meant she knew him and his expressions very well by now. Right now, he was looking really uncomfortable. Damn it, he couldn't even look straight at her. Nothing, Anko-sama, he said, trying and failing to sound casual. I'm Dash. Yeah, she interrupted him. Let me stop you right there. First of all, how often did I tell you to not call me Sama already? Just call me Anko. Not that she generally minded being addressed respectfully like that, mind you. Anko liked it just fine when lesser snakes spoke to her like that. Aida was her friend, though, so he should call her by her name. But that's beside the point. Now cut the crap and tell me what's going on. His light green eyes met hers for a second before he turned away again with a low hiss as his entire body twitched uneasily. It's really nothing, Dash. There is, she interrupted him again while crossing her arms in front of her and starting to tap the ground with one foot. And you're going to tell me what it is? Right now. Anko could see in the way he lowered his head that she had won this confrontation. One of the snakes that recently returned spoke of dark tales, he said hesitantly. Of evil doings and wicked acts, and attacks carried out during the middle of the night. Evil doings and wicked acts, Anko repeated in her mind, brows furrowed. What does that mean? Then her eyes widened. No way, could it be? She felt her heartbeat quickening. You said that these tales come from a snake that recently returned. Do you mean physically returned as in, it slithered all the way herself, or do you mean returned as in, coming back from being summoned? If possible, Aida now looked even more uncomfortable than before. The latter, Anko-sama. For one moment, the entire world became silent. She didn't even care that Aida had addressed her as Sama again, all that mattered was that this must be Orochimaru. It had to be. After all, there was nobody else who could summon snakes other than the two of them. The only being who could track both the snakes that were summoned outside of Ryokai Cave as well as their summoners was the White Snake Sage, but she had denied every one of Anko's requests to tell her Orochimaru's location. The only other way to find him through the snakes was finding one who was recently summoned by him and willing to tell her where. Unfortunately, the ones she found that fulfilled these criteria either denied her as well or simply lacked the intelligence to be of any help. Because of that, she had ultimately given up on this approach. Who would have thought that all she needed to do was to have some patience? Where did these attacks happen? She asked urgently. You know, don't you? Tell me. I don't think dash. Damn it, Ada. You know what that bastard did, and you know that I vowed to bring him to justice. If you know something, please help me. Anko could see his mental struggle as clear as day. He didn't want her to fight Orochimaru, but he could also understand her motives. His desire to keep her safe and his willingness to help her achieve her goal were at odds with each other, and it was unclear which side would win. As it turned out, it happened to be the latter. Snakes were predators first and foremost, after all. It wasn't in their nature to just sit back and do nothing when their prey was within reach. Itaka waited for several minutes in the underground before he created a clone to check out the situation. He could have gone himself, of course, but why do that and risk being killed? Sticking his head out of the ground to look around left someone way too open and defenseless for his liking. It was such a shame that this technique only allowed its user to feel the magnetic forces of people that actually stood on the floor. Those that were in trees or on a body of water were unfortunately invisible. His clone returned a few moments later and signaled that it was safe to come out, but even with that, Itaka couldn't help but be surprised when he broke through the surface and found himself in a sunlit clearing with a distinct lack of mist. He and his clone shared a quick glance, but neither had an answer for why this was the case. Surely Kushimaru and Jinin weren't dead yet, were they? This could be another trap. Maybe they were trying to lull them into a false sense of safety before trying to kill them when their guard was down. However, no matter whether that was the case or not, there was no reason not to go find his teammates in the meantime as long as he was careful. With that in mind, he began running towards where he could feel Kakashi's presence in the distance, his clone running a fair distance ahead of him in case there was a trap. There was none. He reached Kakashi in less than 5 minutes, his eyes instantly checking him up to evaluate his state and... You're injured. He had apparently already felt his presence, not surprising considering Itaki hadn't tried to stay undetected and now turned around with a lazy wave, Sharingan once again hidden behind his forehead protector. Yo, Kakashi greeted him, completely ignoring his comment. It's good to see that you're alright. I was afraid of what would happen if I told Shisui-san that you died under my watch. While the sight of the older man standing casually with one hand in his pocket and once again one-eyed calmed him down somewhat, that did little to minor his annoyance at the man ignoring his statement. Well, he thought. At least I can be pretty sure our opponents are gone now. Kakashi wouldn't have hidden his Sharingan away if he thought there was even the slightest danger, after all. I can't say the same for you, he replied evenly as he stepped closer to get a better look at the gashes on his left shoulder and back. Can I expect Gai-san to come and complain to me about letting his eternal rival getting hurt? It's more likely who he will seek out to help me regain my power of youth, Kakashi chuckled with just a pinch of desperation. Then, when Itaka stepped behind him to heal his injuries, he turned his head around as much as he could to watch him work. Hey, do you even know what you're doing? It would be troublesome if you made it even worse. However, contrary to his words, he didn't move away or tried to stop him and let Itaka patch him up without putting up a fight. He resisted the urge to roll his eyes. I do, yes. You saw me walking out from one of Tsunade-sama's seminars a little more than a week ago, didn't you? I did, but I also remember that these seminars were held for only 2 weeks at that point. There are 2 classes per week, if I remember correctly, so you had only 4 classes at most. Which was fortunately enough to have learned a few basics. And some basics were truly all he knew. In the other timeline, he had participated in the medic classes for Umbu and even looked a bit into healing when his illness got worse, but the former really only covered the absolute backbones while the latter had been focused on medicine rather than actual medical techniques. It was enough to form a good foundation for the aforementioned seminars, but that was it. So far, Itaka could use only one medical ninjutsu, which was also the most basic one. It required little skill and did little more than pump chakra into a body to stimulate regeneration, and it only healed minor wounds because the ratio of chakra to healing progress was so poor. A person with sufficient chakra could theoretically use this technique to heal every and all wound, but that wasn't recommended. Serious wounds that were treated this way usually didn't heal correctly in that the bones got more brittle and the muscles grew weaker. Generally speaking, The basic technique was used to stabilize a patient until someone with more expertise could use a more specialized technique to heal them correctly. Fortunately, as Kakashi's were only superficial, it was the perfect fit for this situation. Let's hope Zabuza isn't in a worse state, he thought. It would be a problem if I were forced to use a technique I have only read about and never actually practiced. As if on command, the Kirinin appeared a few seconds later, mostly uninjured aside from one shallow cut on his right shoulder that had already stopped bleeding. So you two are still alive, huh? He then gave Kakashi an appraising look. You already need healing? Sure, you can handle this mission, Copy Ninja. Much to Zabuza's visible annoyance, Kakashi's only reaction was a nondescript, one-eyed smile. Just some scratches, I assure you. Itake here was merely a bit too eager to test his newfound healer abilities. Zabuza-san, Itake spoke up before the man could give a no doubt snarky reply. Shall I look over your injury as well? I dash. The swordsman spat on the ground. I don't need a healer for a little scratch like this, so keep your hands to yourself. Itake nodded. While he thought he should at least offer his services, he had expected nothing less. Well then, Kakashi said when it became clear that no one else felt like continuing this conversation. Now that we're all here, why don't we compare what happened after we got separated? I assume it's probably too much to hope for that one of you was successful in killing your opponent. I agree, Itake spoke up first to avoid giving Zabuza the chance to complain. Sharing intel is essential in case we will fight another opponent than today in our next confrontation with them. Zabuza still didn't seem very keen on the idea, but at least didn't disagree. If Itake would be forced to take a guess, he would say that he was just in a terrible mood because their targets had managed to escape them with such ease. As they shared their stories with each other, a few similarities could be spotted immediately. For one thing, their strategies had been too simple. Yes, they utilized the silent killing technique with great skill, but in the end, there had been few variations. While definitively still very dangerous and very effective, especially for someone who was confronted with it for the first time, Kakashi and Itake both have shown that these odds could be overcome relatively quickly by being observant. Zabuza, who had managed to force his opponent into direct combat almost from the very beginning, also added that in hindsight, Jinin's moves had been rather lacking compared to what he remembered from the past. These things put together created a clear picture. This had been nothing more than a test. Furthermore, every single opponent each of them had fought had been a water clone. While that didn't make it impossible that the originals had been close by as well, the three of them found it rather unlikely. Either they had been close enough to hear the explosion in the village or were otherwise informed by it and then sent clones to check up on the scene, or they had kept clones in the area from the beginning. The former was the much more realistic possibility, but if the latter was true, it might indicate that they had been expecting strong opponents to eventually trigger their trap. Based on the clone Itake had fought, Kushimaru and Jinin had put a lot of chakra into their clones to make sure that they weren't as easily destroyed as normal water clones. Wasting so much energy only to potentially kill some random people that might accidentally find the village seemed overkill. Of course, the trap might also have been for Takinins. This was their nation, after all. But even then, the likelihood of especially strong shinobi being sent to investigate the village was slim, so why bother leaving so powerful clones behind? I still say that it's more likely the originals were in the area during the fight, Zabuza said with crossed arms. Not only are these two not the types to stay away from a confrontation, but they would also need to observe our fight if this was actually a test. After all, water clones don't transfer memories. Considering how much chakra they already invested into this, it wouldn't make much of a difference if they created a shadow clone with the sole purpose of observing us as well. Zabuza scoffed at Itake's remark. The Kage Bunshin no Jutsu is a secret jutsu from Konoha. Where should they have learned it? Itake wanted to retort that think such as something being a secret jutsu rarely ever stopped other nations from learning them somehow as well, but he stopped himself. No need to irritate the man even further. Anyway, Kakashi fortunately brought the attention back to him. There is something else you need to know. He then proceeded by taking out a scroll and releasing its content with a little puff of smoke. Itake's eyes widened at the sight of a corpse with a forehead protector from Takigakuer. Kakashi's voice was somber when he continued. It appears we weren't the first ones on the scene. 1,000 thoughts went through Ataka's head as he dismissed old theories and came up with new ones. If they had already eliminated the Takinins, then why were there still the clones present? Were they just supposed to stay at the scene as long as they could to kill as many people as possible, or had they actually been waiting for Ataki and his team and only killed the shinobi from Taki because they just so happened to arrive before them? Was this proof that the originals had been closed the entire time? Then another thought came to his head. Will this situation deteriorate into an actual political incident? Itaka wouldn't put it past Taki to blame Konoha for the death of their shinobi. The reasoning that they only died because his team couldn't kill their targets before it came to this tragedy was weak, but with how bad the relationship between their two villages was, it was possible that Takigakuer would try to convince their daimyo that this was the case. He was pulled from his thought when Zabuza plunged his broken sword into the corpse's body. Itaka's head jerked towards the man at the same time as Kakashi shouted, "What do you think you're doing?" The swordsman ignored them both and instead held his sword above his head, watching with a strange gleam in his eye as it began to repair itself. There was a tense silence when the process was over, with him and Kakashi looking at Zabuza with a mixture to disgust and anger, while Zabuza appeared completely unbothered by that. Only when he had finished inspecting his weapon, which was now complete again, did he turn to her with something akin to amusement on his face. "Well, we should hurry. It would be a shame if we arrive at the daimyo's place only to find him already dead, right?" He then vanished in a shunshin without waiting for them to answer. Itaki and Kakashi shared a long glance with each other before the latter sighed and sealed the body back into the scroll. If every single shinobi from Kirigakure is like this, I'm not sure if this alliance of ours has a future. Itaka was suddenly reminded that his teammate had made bad experiences with Kirinins in the past. In fact, if he remembered correctly, he had even been forced to kill one of his original teammates because of them. However, instead of mentioning that, he said, "The ones I have met a few years ago during my stay in the Land of Water were decent." Kakashi only gave a nondescript huff before going after Zabuza, shortly followed by Itaki himself. "What is my name?" She paced around her cell completely uncaring of the pain that every yet so little movement brought her, alternating between bipedal and quadrupedal walking with no real system behind it. What is my name? After all, her entire existence had been nothing but pain and suffering for a long time now. When all you had in a world of eternal darkness and silence was pain, when your only companion was pain, when the only thing that never lied to you was pain, you became pain. It was all she had left, the only thing that was still hers, so she didn't shy away from it, no, she embraced it. What is my name? It was only now that she truly realized how small her cell truly was. During all the time she had spent chained to the wall or sitting in one corner, it had appeared so unbelievable big. In the darkness, it had looked endless. But now that she was actually moving, she realized that it was barely big enough to take 5 steps in any direction before running into a wall. What is my name? There were so many things inside her head that made no sense. Images from people she felt she should know but didn't, buildings she must have seen somewhere but couldn't say where, and names without faces to put them to. What? Eyes. My name. The one and only thing she could remember clear as day was them. A pale-skinned man with long, silky hair, and this boy with brown hair and a pair of glasses that followed him behind like a loyal dog. They were the ones that made her what she was now, who unmade her, and they were the ones that brought all the misery into her life. My name. Why can't I remember? Why? She couldn't remember a thing from before this hell. She couldn't remember what friends she might have had, who her parents were, not even how she herself looked like or. What is my name? Chapter 35, Swordsman of the Mist v. Let's start this from the beginning. Swordsman of the Mist v. So we have to deal with a number of Konohanin, huh? The other person snorted. Who cares about them? Zabuza is with them. He then threw the masked man in front of him a hard glare. And don't even think about attacking him. He's mine. Although he knew that Jinin couldn't see it behind his mask, Kushimaru rolled his eyes. I'm much more interested in that Uchiha boy myself anyway. Remember, he's the one who supposedly got the stone rolling to get Konoha involved in Kiri's affairs. You still care about that shithole of a place. I care about the fact that it was much easier to have some fun before we were hunted down by everyone on the Dem continent. Jinan's lips curved upwards. Fair enough. Then he suddenly grew more serious. I guess it's good that you're more interested in him. Our host might be displeased if these tree huggers find his base. Let him be annoyed, Kushamara thought with a scowl. As far as he was concerned, they have relied on that person for way too long now. However, he knew better than to say that out loud when there were several pairs of ears listening into their conversation. Well, Jinan continued. This means you take the Uchiha boy while I play a bit with Zabuza. He chuckled. That leaves only the copy ninja for that bitch, then. That thought brightened his mood. At least she will be much easier to deal with as long as she has a good fight to look forward to. And who knew? Maybe she and the copy ninja would kill each other, getting rid of two annoyances for them at the same time. And once we dealt with these troublemakers, we will leave. Jinan might be comfortable with their current situation, but he wasn't. If push comes to shove, I will just leave on my own. Itaki hadn't been to any of the capitals in this timeline yet, but he could remember doing so in the previous one. Take the Land of Fire, for example. While Konohagakure had by far the largest shinobi population, almost 95% of it in fact, and the strongest military force in the country, the village was only its second largest population hub. The first place in that respect went hands down to the capital where the daimyo resided and which had nearly twice as many inhabitants as Konoha. The city had wide, clean streets, magnificent buildings, gorgeous parks dotted with masterfully crafted statues and fountains, and in the city's center stood the daimyo's great palace. Dozens of buildings, of which even the smallest could easily house over 100 people at a time and often spanned several floors, were scattered over the area, white and light gray walls framed by a mixture of red and black roof tiles with golden accents, and sprawling gardens with ponds and small streams were everywhere. The imperial palace of the Land of Fire was a testament to pure wealth and luxury that extended even to the interior, where hundreds of priceless paintings hung alongside artifacts that had been looted over centuries in one war or another. The capital of the Land of Waterfalls was much smaller than that, and the palace much less impressive. Still a place where wealth could be found, of course, but lacking compared to its neighbors. Still, when their team finally reached the city, it was a sight for sore eyes. No matter whether their reason was worry about the daimyo himself or the desire to be here when their targets tried to assassinate him, all three of them were relieved to have finally arrived. Regardless of what they would find, at least they would have an answer at all. The good news was that the daimyo of the Land of Waterfalls was in the best of health when they arrived at his palace. Unfortunately, the bad news was that he didn't take their warnings of a possible threat seriously at all. The man had black eyes and gray hair, most prominently shown from his mustache that fell down his grim and serious face. He wore a long-sleeved shirt under a yellow, sleeveless jacket with red trimmings, and he also carried a fan and wore a headdress with his nation's symbol on it. Contrary to his grim appearance, however, he was a rather relaxed individual. No, even calling him laid back wouldn't do him justice. He was a prime example of a person who enjoyed all the advantages of being born into a royal family and ended up squandering all the wealth of his ancestors on parties and the likes. He was the kind of person that couldn't understand that his status alone wasn't enough to keep him safe. Even the dead shinobi they showed him to his great disgust, of course, wasn't enough proof to convince him. To use his words, shinobi die all the time, so what does one more or less even matter? Thus, while he was more than happy to play host to his good friends from Konoha, he ignored every and all attempts to convince him of the danger he was in. They were given luxurious rooms in the main wing of the palace, had the permission to walk around freely through the entire complex, and even were invited to dine with him every single evening, but having a real conversation with him was impossible. They had arrived here 3 days ago, and Itaki had almost reached the point where he actually considered going behind the daimyo's back to talk with his security staff, regardless of the risk of accidentally offending their host. The only thing that still held him back from doing just that was that they were unlikely to take him any more serious. Furthermore, by the hidden glares he could feel on the back of his head almost all the time, the hidden watchers weren't well disposed towards them either. Although the entire situation was exhausting, he probably would have felt more patience towards it if he weren't the only one in his team to regularly interact with the daimyo, but alas. Kakashi had told him early on that he found himself unsuited for prolonged exposure to such esteemed person as the daimyo and that Itachi was much better suited for the job, citing that as the Uchiha heir, he was the closest thing Konoha had to royalty aside from Tsunade. Then, before Itachi had the chance to tell him how ridiculous that notion was, the daimyo in question appeared and Kakashi used the opportunity to escape. His appearances since then were far and wide in between, limiting themselves to the absolute minimum required to be polite while spending the rest of the time searching for their Kushimaru and Jinin in the area surrounding the city. Zabuza, on the other hand, hadn't even tried to be subtle and used the first opportunity that presented itself to vanish in the name of looking for traces of their targets as well. For that, Itachi was actually a little bit thankful as he doubted that the swordsman would contribute anything useful in a polite discussion anyway. In fact, it was much more likely that his character would only result in another incident Itachi and possible Kakashi were forced to clean up afterwards. Needless to say, Itachi was tired of dealing with this situation. "You're one of the shinobi from Konoha, aren't you?" a deep voice from behind him said. The Uchiha brat. Turning around, he saw a middle-aged man with a powerful stature standing in the doorway to the building Itachi had just left on his way to the nearest garden. "I am," he said. "I don't think we have had the pleasure to meet yet. In Konoha, it's polite to introduce yourself first before speaking to someone." The other man scoffed. "I don't care what you tree huggers think is polite or not. However, what I do care about is whether you guys were the ones who killed Tani." The forehead protector around his arm easily identified him as a shinobi from Takigakuer, so the person he must be referring to was. "If you're talking about the man we brought with us as proof of the danger your daimyo is in, I must disappoint you. Although you should already know that, considering you were listening in on that conversation." That was actually just a fair guess, but going by the grimace on the man's face, it was true. As the ones in charge of Daimyo Dano's safety, it's only right that we're close in case anyone like you tries something funny. We're always by his side to protect him with our lives. You're not supposed to be noticed, though. However, saying that would escalate the situation even further, and no matter how bad his mood was, Itachi didn't want to start a fight in the Daimo's gardens. "If you're so worried about his safety, maybe you should consider if we're telling the truth and prepare for dash. I don't want to hear that ludicrous tale about those former swordsmen of the mist again," the man interrupted him with an angry glare as he crossed his arms in front of his chest. "As far as I'm concerned, the only one of that cursed group currently in our country is the man with you who's known as the Demon of the Hidden Mist. If you're asking me, he's probably the most likely suspect right now." Inwardly, Itachi cursed Zabuza for having plunged his weapon into the corpse's body. It was fortunate that nobody had thought about how much the wound on its chest matched Kubikari Basho, but when they did, it would be hard to explain away. "And why would we bring him here if we were the culprits, then?" Itachi said, appealing to the man's sense of logic. Unfortunately, it wasn't very effective. "You tell me that," he spat, saliva flying out of his mouth. "What are Konoha and Kiri planning that makes you play such a double game? Is it a ploy to take over the land of waterfalls? Especially you murderers from the Hidden Leaf got it in for us for a long time now. What, do you plan to outright annex us now that you already have the daimyo's favor and dash?" "Akame," a joyous voice came from behind the man, cutting him off. "Why, what are you doing here? Aren't you usually visiting your sister at this time of the day? And oh, is that you, Uchiha-san? What a pleasant surprise." The person that appeared and whom both Itachi and the man that was apparently called Akame greeted with a bow was none other than the daimyo himself. "I was just on my way there, Daimyo-sama," Akame said, his voice now perfectly polite. "I merely ran into one of our guests and got a bit delayed. In all our chatting, we must have lost track of time. That is definitively one way to put it." Unlike Itachi, the daimyo was easily fooled. "Is that so? I'm glad you're getting along so well. Our nations are allies, so we all should strive to become good friends." Akame bowed again. "As you say, Daimyo Dano. Now, if you would excuse me." Of course, of course. "And please, give my regards to your sister. Also tell her that she's always welcome in my halls." "Thank you, Daimyo Dano. I will." He then vanished, but not before Itachi saw him throwing a dark look at his liege. It seems the daimyo is as unpopular with his native shinobi as I have heard. That unfortunately meant that the other man's attention was now fully on him. Say, Uchiha-san, I was just about to have a late brunch in the gardens. Would you like to join me? I'm sure you must have many more interesting stories to tell. He didn't. In fact, he could think of few things he wanted less. However, he also had no good reason to decline, and if there was even the slightest chance he could finally bring him to understand his current position. You honor me with your invitation, Daimyo Dano. I would love to join you. Kakashi threw a look up the sky from where he sat on the balcony of his quarters, frowning when the first rays of light of the just rising sun hit his face. So it's already this late, huh? I guess I should prepare to continue the search soon. It was still early in the morning, of course, but every bit of daylight was important. While he, Pakun, and the rest of their pack had already searched through vast stretches of land while they didn't have anything with their target's smell to look out for, there shouldn't be many other people in the area who ran around with traces of blood with little success. There was still a lot of it left. And if they were wrong and the two missing nin weren't after the daimyo's life, well, then they would probably continue to fruitlessly search for a trail for a long time to come. There was a reason the Hokage hadn't put a time limit on this mission, after all. That didn't mean he enjoyed getting up early to continue the search right now. And just when the book was starting to get interesting too. However, he was a shinobi through and through. Like it or not, he would do his job, and he would do it right. This wasn't some meaningless task of little importance, but an elimination mission. Kakashi didn't allow himself to slack on those. As soon as Zabuza returned from his shift, it would be Kakashi's turn to be back out there. For a moment, he felt pity for his poor teammate who was forced to spend most of his time in the daimyo's presence and thus had no time to actively contribute to their mission. Kakashi didn't think he could do what Itachi was doing. Dealing with an ignorant, pompous fool in a noble court must be so much more frustrating than merely returning without anything new from a search. Ultimately, none of them expected this to be a short mission, so not finding anything this early into it was hardly bothersome. Thinking of the devil. Well, Itachi, is there anything new you want to share with me, or why do you search me out this early in the morning? Shouldn't you be with our gracious host right now? The slight irritation he could see in Itachi's eyes when the younger boy gave him a narrow-eyed look spoke volumes over how annoyed he must be. He was usually much more composed than that. Although to be fair, Kakashi didn't think he would show even that little if there were anyone else present. The both of them had gone on many missions in the past and consequently knew each other rather well, while Zabuza, for example, was not only a stranger but a stranger from another nation. But still. Yeah, I definitely got the better deal in this. Searching for our targets all day long seems much less troublesome. Daimyo Dano decided that he felt in the mood for a celebration, so he feasted the entire night and went to bed just a few minutes ago. Although Itachi used the proper honorific, there was no respect whatsoever in his voice when he said it. I doubt he will have the need of any company for the foreseeable future aside from maybe one of his mistresses. Aside from maybe the latter part, Kakashi actually knew that already. He had just wanted to tease the boy a little bit. Is that so? And can I assume that your attempts at persuasion were no more effective in his no doubt intoxicated state than usual? Itachi didn't even bother replying, his dry expression being all the answer needed. Well, if it's any consolation, our own efforts weren't any more successful than yours. It isn't. Kakashi shrugged as if to say, well, what can you do, as he leaned back against the balcony's wall with both his hands in his pockets. However, Itachi continued after a few seconds, I did have an engaging conversation with one of the daimyo's guards in the afternoon. Oh. Now things were getting more interesting. And what did this guard have to say? It appears that he and probably his comrades as well think that we were the ones to kill the shinobi you found and that we did this in name of some sinister plot to conquer the land of waterfalls for Konoha. Now that was unexpected. And why would we bring the corpse here if we were the culprits behind his death? I'm afraid his reasoning wasn't entirely cogent, Itachi said with a slight upturn of his lips. However, he seemed quite confident that it was part of our aforementioned ploy. And he had no further arguments to back this theory up. It didn't seem like it, no. Kakashi just barely resisted the urge to make a face. He understood that Takigakure didn't like Konoha very much, but one of them actually confronting Itaka with such half-baked accusations spoke of a level of anger that went above mere dislike. He also referred to us as murderers of the hidden leaf. His eyes widened at Itaka's words. Then this is really still about that incident? Itaka nodded. That's what I think, too. That's a long time to hold a grudge over such a small thing. The Third Great Ninja War was a result of countless smaller conflicts between the various smaller nations on the continent in which the great nations intervened and that ultimately got out of hand. One of these small conflicts had been between the Land of Waterfalls and the Land of Iron that was the result of Takinins crossing the border for scouting missions and killing a number of samurai in the process. Konoha, who was present at the time in form of a team that was there on a diplomatic mission, intervened to curry some favor with the local ruler by tracking down and eliminating the intruders. However, one of them managed to escape and tell his tale. Konoha had the more powerful military and even was in the position of actually having had a legitimate reason to act as they did, meaning Taki couldn't do much about this incident. Furthermore, having your shinobi die on secret missions in enemy territory was a common enough thing, so this entire event shouldn't have had any meaningful impact at all to begin with. Unfortunately, the fact that one of the killed Takinins was not only the village leader's son but also the carrier of a rare Kekii Genkai meant that people were much more emotional about it than they usually would have been. Kakashi pulled himself from his thoughts. You would think that after all the bloodshed of the last war, such a small event that happened before it would be long forgotten. Surprisingly, Itaka shook his head. While much smaller in scale, this event was also much more personal. The team that died wasn't part of any big battles where their killers were faceless entities but victims of a small group of Konohanin specifically. Which then makes it easier to blame us, Kakashi finished, realizing where his teammate was going. That didn't mean they had any hard feelings towards their other enemies as well, of course, but considering this incident happened even before the war meant the emotions had already existed by the time armies finally crashed against one another. The outbreak of fighting had probably only deepened the already existing wounds even further. He was about to open his mouth to continue the conversation when a sudden cawing interrupted him, and a crow landed on Itaka's shoulder shortly afterwards. The Uchiha instantly grew serious while Kakashi tensed as well. I sent that crow after you and Zabuza whenever you went outside the city, Itaki explained, looking him straight in the eye. It had the order to return to me immediately when one of you was in trouble. This revelation didn't come as much of a surprise. Kakashi had noticed the crow following him, and while Zabuza hadn't said anything, he was sure that the man had noticed it as well. They both understood what it was doing, so Kakashi would have been able to guess what its sudden appearance meant even without Itaki explaining it to him. He would have liked to be wrong, though. There was no need for any further conversations after that. On a silent command, the crow took off Itaka's shoulder to lead the way while the two of them ran after it without speaking as much as a single word. Zabuza had never really thought about the possibility of signing a contract with an animal clan. Aside from the fact that those contracts were exceptionally rare and thus almost impossible to get your hands on, he also hadn't seen a good reason to actually go after one. Sure, he had heard stories of the likes of Hanzo of the Salamander or the legendary Sunin and the strength of the summon that had given them their reputation just like everyone else, but honestly, he had always assumed they were little more than pets that were mostly useless. Intelligent pets to be sure, but pets nonetheless. Now, however, he realized that he might have been a little too hasty with his judgment. While Zabuza was still not entirely convinced of the idea that they could be helpful in a fight, there were definitely some uses for them if the dog at his feet was anything to go by. After all, it was only thanks to it that he might have finally found his dear old friends. "You're sure they're there?" he asked the brown dog that was crouching behind a bush to his right. "The smell of blood comes from that cave, no doubt about it." It then tilted its head. "There is also a yucky smell of sickness, though." Zabuza snorted. "So one of them got sick? Sounds good to me." No. I don't think it's them. There seem to be a lot of sick people, I think. Or at least there used to be many sick people. Most of the scents are quite old, so either some got better and left or they died, huh. While Kushimaru and Jinin never went so far as to actually kidnap and torture their victims, they did like to drag out the agony of their beaten foes. Now that they were missing nins and thus had less opportunity to fight to their heart's content, It wasn't entirely unreasonable to assume that they would resort to torture to amuse themselves. The dog still seemed to be thoughtful. If they did, the corpses were either destroyed immediately or aren't anywhere close. It took a few deep sniffs. I can't smell any scent of decay anywhere close by. Of course you can't, he said dryly. Who would like to have their base filled with the smell of corpses? As soon as he finished talking, he cautiously stepped out of the woods onto the open plain that lied between it and the cave around 100 meters in front of him. The dog naturally panicked immediately. Hey, what do you think you're doing? We need to go back and get Dash. We can get them after we confirmed whether they're actually here or not, he interrupted with a sideways smirk. We don't want them to come all this way for nothing, do we? Though if you really insist, I don't mind if you go ahead and get them while I check this out on my own. It whined and complained, but in the end, it followed him just as he had thought it would. Whether they were dogs or humans, inhabitants of Konoha were all the same. The two of them slowly but surely crossed the open plain, prepared to jump away in case they walked straight into a trap. However, much to Zabuza's surprise, they reached the entrance to the cave without anyone or anything trying to stop them. If this is really Kushimaru's and Jinan's hideout, they have grown really careless. There are probably traps inside, the dog said as if it had read his mind. Traps on the outside run the risk of attracting unwanted attention, while on the inside there is not only much less space to dodge attacks but also the advantage of the whole complex collapsing and burying intruders alive. I know that, he growled, annoyed at being lectured by a dog. Seeing as the cave was empty, he took a few careful steps inside, paying close attention to the ground as to not accidentally trigger a trap and proof that furry little shit right. A single glance revealed that the cave itself was a rather small, circular room with a downwards leading pathway as its only feature worth mentioning. Or to be more precise, it wasn't the path itself that was noteworthy but the big rock that had obviously been pushed aside to open it. He smirked. Got ya. Wonderful, the dog said impatiently. Now that we confirmed that they're probably here, we really should go back to get Kakashi and Ataka-san. Zabuza rolled his eyes but conceded the point. It was probably a bad idea to fight both his former comrades on his own. Of course, it was just when he turned around that he could sense the flare of a chakra signature. A moment later, an explosion blew up the cave's entrance. Check the description for the links to the author.